Anabaptist. And I just want to talk about the Anabaptist. I'll give you some background information. This is the Radical Reformation, and published on May 1997, and it's on soft.com believe, which you can find on monergism. You can find this article on monergism, called the Radical Reformation. There's quite a lot of articles on monergism uh, if you Google Radical Reformation. So I just want to talk, just have some thoughts about the Anabaptist. Uh, so let's just, also known as the left wing of the Reformation and the Third Reformation, it includes all reforming elements most identified with the Magisterial Reformation. Common to all its participation was disappointment with moral aspects of territorial Protestantism and the rejection of some of its doctrines and institutions, while variously interlocking historical connections and doctrinal variations limited the validity of typological and ideological classification. Three main groupings of radicals have been identified: Anabaptist, spiritualist, and evangelical rationalist. The Anabaptist movement had a varied cast of characters. From it evolved the Free Church tradition. From Luther to 20th century scholar Karl Hall, the opinion prevailed that Anabaptists began with the revolutionists and spiritualizers such as the Zwickau prophets and Thomas Müntzer, and reached its logical conclusion with the violent Munsterites. The 1940s, Harold Bender inaugurated a new era in American Anabaptist studies, using primary sources and following up directions indicated earlier by C. H. Cornelius and other Europeans. Bender distinguished between Anabaptist and revolutionist. He placed Anabaptist origins in the circle of Conrad Grebel, which left Zwingli's Reformation, when Zwingli compromised its biblical basis. From Zurich, the movement was spread by missionaries from Switzerland to Austria and Moravia, South Germany, and the Low Countries. Bender described the movement as the logical culmination of the reform began but left unfinished by Luther and Zwingli. Its principal characteristics were discipleship, biblicism, and pacifism. Beginning in the late 1960s, scholars challenged and, to a considerable measure, reoriented Bender's findings. They described a pluralistic rather than a homogeneous movement with several points of origin and a multiplicity of reforming impulses. Swiss Anabaptism. Anabaptism in Switzerland developed from Zwingli's early supporters. These future radicals included Grebel's circle, which gathered in the homes of Andreas Kattelberger for a Bible study, and priests from the outlying towns of Zurich. For different reasons, the urban and rural radicals became disillusioned with Zwingli's reform. Seeing the Bible as an alternative authority to Rome, Grebel's circle desired Zwingli to proceed rapidly to purify the city's religious establishment of such corruption as the Mass. When Zwingli allowed the city council to determine the speed of the Reformation, it seemed to the radicals the substitution of one oppressive authority for another. The radical movement developed social as well as religious dimensions when its members joined forces with rural priests such as Simon Stumford, Hongard, and William Reuben, who sought to establish self-governing Volkerinnen in the rural communities, independent of Zurich's central authority, both religious and civil. The rebaptisms, which occurred first on January 21st, 1525, and from which come the name Anabaptism, originally expressed as an anti-clerical opposition to civil and religious authority outside the local parish rather than the free church concept. Ultimately, the attempt to become a mass movement failed, and there emerged the idea of a church of the separated, persecuted, and defenseless minority. The Schleinchem article of 1527, edited by Michael Sattler, consolidated the Swiss Anabaptism. Its goal was to be a purification of existing Christianity as it was from the early Zurich radicals, but rather the separation of congregation of believers from the world. Thus the Schleil theme first emerged the idea of a free church. These Swiss brethren came to be known for their legalistic approach to the Bible, and salvation manifesting itself in creation of separated congregation and baptism, which symbolized that salvation and made the baptism a member of the congregation. So that's like more of a kind of scholarly resume. But if you go on monergism, Google Radical Reformation Anabaptist, there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It's about 40 articles there on the Anabaptist. So I just want to talk briefly, just a couple of things about it. The Anabaptists were a mixed bag. There were like hyper charismatics that were quite crazy, that exalted experience above the Bible. There were revolutionists who wanted to like start revolt and revolutions. There were more pacifists like Meno and the Mennonites, who were more pacifist and just wanted to get back to simplicity of the gospel. But the issue, I think, that the main issue that seems to come out in what I've read today with the Anabaptists and the Reformers is the issue of church and state. The Anabaptists definitely didn't want the state to be interfering in church life, whereas the Reformers, they didn't want to go too radical in their Reformation. They wanted to try and work with the state, try and reform the church. From within, and then eventually they had to leave the church like Luther and Calvin. But they didn't really want to be as radical in getting back to a simplicity of the church. They still wanted to hold on to certain things, like cooperation with the state and allowing the state to say things about the church. And I think that's the main issue. The thing that I get out of reading the history is many of these Anabaptists were believers, and yet they got persecuted, they were killed, they were martyred by the Reformers. Now, it's stated that the Reformers didn't call for their death, but many of their followers and people who were influenced by the Reformers did have some of the Anabaptists martyred and killed. What that teaches me is this statement I think has to be qualified. People say, I've heard theologians say, Reformed theologians say, the magisterial reformers. The magisterial reformers. But the reformers, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, they were just men of clay. They weren't perfect. You know, the Reformation was good in that the church went back to the gospel and biblical faith, but they weren't perfect, and things were done that were ugly. And one of the ugly things that were done is the persecution of the Anabaptists. And some of these Anabaptists did not deserve to die as martyrs. And so it shows you that we have to be careful when we have this black and white thing where we say the magisterial reformers, as if Luther was perfect or Calvin was perfect. They weren't perfect. They made some big mistakes. Zwingli made mistakes. And that's all I wanted to say, really, is that we shouldn't be blinkered to the faults of people that we admire, but to recognize that they did have faults. And I think one of the faults was the reformers should have helped some of the Anabaptists, because some of them were genuine believers. I'm not saying all were, but some of them were genuine believers, and they should have stood up for them. And some of them got killed, and I think it was wrong. So, you know, church history can be messy, and we have to walk with humility that we don't do these kind of things. or be these kind of people or make these kind of mistakes. And we shouldn't like have blinkered, be blinkered from the faults of our forefathers. That's what I'm thinking. Those are my thoughts. All right. Take care now, and God bless you. And please let me know what you think about the Anabaptist. Do some research on it, read about it. Very interesting. Some interesting characters, some interesting things that went there. And what's your view about church and state? Does the state have a right to interfere in the church or not? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. Just a quick video about the Anabaptists. I think that the reformers should have supported the true believers in the Anabaptist movement. There were some, the Anabaptist movement were there were a variety of different people, but there were some, like the Mennonites, that were genuine believers who genuinely wanted to get back. Zwingli and others should have encouraged them and helped them, but instead they were persecuted. Some of them deserved to be persecuted because they were wacko jackos, they were doing bad things, like trying to start revolution and fight and kill people. But some of them were genuine and they should have been encouraged, and instead they got persecuted. All right, God bless you and take care. Love you all. Have a good evening. Take care.